PAC members, welcome back. I'm so excited to join you again this month. I'm Jocelyn Yadian. I'm the Dog Aging Project Social Media Specialist at Texas A&M. But before we get started, we have some brief news roundup for you. The Dog Aging Project has been in the news. First, check out the recent article about the Dog Aging Project in Discover magazine. Find the link at the dog park or on any of our social media channels. So whether you've been with us for years or thinking about joining, this article provides a great overview of what our project is all about. The Seattle Times also covered our project recently and highlighted Washington State PAC members Bagel and Hannah. This article looks behind the scenes and spoke to members of our teams all across the country. It even gives the dog park a shout out, so check it out. Finally, if you're a member of the American Kennel Club, or AKC, you may have seen the Dog Aging Project was mentioned in their recent newsletter. We're super excited to have the support of the AKC in helping the PAC grow. As you probably know, recruitment is always ongoing. We're always accepting dogs of all ages, all breeds, all across the country. And right now, especially, we're looking for intact dogs. So if your pup has never been spayed or neutered, sign them up. Or even better, tell a friend. And just a quick reminder, we're still limited to 1 dog per household. So you can find all these links and all these articles and discussion at the dog park, so make sure to check it out. Now, I think today's event will be especially exciting, given all the discussion about it at the dog park. Today, we're hearing from Dr. Evan MacLean and Dr. Emily Bray of the Arizona Canine Cognition Center at the University of Arizona. They're exploring how dogs think and are developing hands-on activities for the Dog Aging Project PAC. Their work, with your help, will inform our research on brain health in dogs. It's super exciting stuff. And so stay tuned. Today's event has been pre-recorded, but will remain available for viewing on our YouTube channel. So like, subscribe, watch this video as many times. And just so you know, we tried to take as many of your questions as we could before recording this event. But no worries, if you still have more questions, after this, head over to the dog park and we'll answer them there. Now, while you're at the dog park, our community forum exclusively for PAC members, be sure to enter the giveaway for some Dog Aging Project stickers. So without further ado, over to you, Evan and Emily.
Great, thank you so much, Jocelyn. We're so excited to be here with you and the PAC members today. So I'm Dr. Emily Bray.
Hi, and I'm Evan MacLean. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, we're really excited to kick this off. So we are both scientists who specialize in studying how dogs think. So that's a pretty niche area. And I don't know about you, Evan, but I think the #1 question I get when I tell people what I do is, how the heck did you end up doing that? And how can I sign up? And so I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and how and why you ended up in this field.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of a circuitous path for me. So when I was an undergraduate in college, I was a psychology major, and I was really interested in questions about the human mind and what makes us, do the things we do, and essentially what human nature is and how we understand it. I took a whole bunch of psychology classes trying to get answers to these questions, and I realized that those answers that I was getting weren't satisfying for me, and I wanted to know something sort of deeper about the mind and the way the mind works. And so I decided that one way that I could get answers to those questions that I was interested in was to try to study the evolution of the mind. And I got really interested in studying the ways that animals think. And so initially I found the only opportunity I could on campus to study animals, and that was actually studying pigeons. So I did my initial work studying how pigeons think about and solve different kinds of problems. And then as a graduate student, I really, at the time, was really interested in trying to understand the human mind. And so I wanted to work with non-human primates. And so I got very lucky, and I got jobs initially working with monkeys, and then in graduate school, studying our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, and doing work in Africa. And towards the end of my graduate work, my doctoral advisor was also doing studies with dogs, and I got interested in this particularly because some of the things that we were studying and some of the things that we thought were really important in terms of what makes humans special, it turns out that that dogs are more similar to people in the way that they think about certain kinds of problems than our closest living relatives are, like great apes. And so particularly when it comes to understanding certain kinds of social information. And so I started studying dogs then, and then I just really got the bug, and I realized the dogs were just such a fascinating species. They're just, everywhere all around us. And for a long time, science had ignored dogs. People thought, well, these are kind of artificial animals and we can't learn that much from studying them. And that tide has really changed. And now people recognize just how amazing dogs are and how much we can learn from them. So that's basically the way that my career has unfolded. How about you? How did you get into this?
Yeah, so I grew up in a house with 2 veterinarians and Labrador retrievers. So dogs were always a big part of my life. And then when I went to college, I started volunteering at the Duke Canine Cognition Center, which is where I met you, actually. And initially it was because I missed my dogs. But then I think similarly to you, became fascinated by the research. And I too had a psychology background. Those were the classes that I was taking at the time. And it was really interesting to me to see how some of these same concepts and experiments that you could do in a human infant, you could also apply across species and do in dogs. So I actually ended up doing my thesis, as you know, on impulse control in dogs. And as I became more involved in the lab, I actually got the hands-on opportunity to go on a couple of research trips out to Canine Companions, which for those of you who don't know is a nationwide nonprofit that provides highly trained service dogs to individuals with disabilities. And they do this totally free of charge to the recipient. But it was really eye-opening to go out and kind of get to interact firsthand with this population of dogs and be able to apply our research in that setting. It was really a big turning point for me. And I think first, just seeing up close the life-changing impact that dogs can have in all these contexts, but specifically this one, the difference that they were making in people's lives. And then second, that our research into how dogs are thinking and processing their world, that can actually play a tangible role in facilitating those partnerships. And so in other words, if we can identify certain traits and tendencies in these dogs, those can then inform the most productive way to train them, to teach them, to interact with them, and also just being able to recognize their natural strengths and aptitudes when it comes to cognition, and using that information can help set them up for success in their future roles, or maybe redirect them to a different role. So I think that was one of my favorite parts, realizing that, not only did I find this really inherently interesting, but it had some real world applications as well. So yeah, and so speaking of, I just threw out the word cognition. That is the primary thing that we study, right? We're part of a canine cognition center. But I think that's a word that people might define or think about differently. And so I was just wondering, how do you define cognition?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a tricky question. I probably change my answer a little bit every time somebody asks me. But I think broadly, I would define cognition as the internal mental processes through which animals acquire, process, store, and act on information. So, basically when we're talking about cognition, we're talking about thought processes. But there's a whole bunch of different sort of stages of what the mind has to do, right? And so from my perspective, cognition begins even with perception and the way that animals make sense of the world around them, right? And as we use this term in animal behavior, Umwelt, which is basically, Umwelt is the sort of subjective way that any organism experiences the world. And it's a really hard thing for us to figure out when we work with non-human animals, because we experience the world as humans, and we're predominantly visual creatures. And other animals experience the world in totally different ways, right? Like, bats use echolocation to travel. Dogs use lots of information from smell. And so, there's the sort of, how do you make sense of the environment? How do you get that information out of the world around you? And then how do you process it? And how do you store it in memory? And then how do you later make decisions about that guide your behavior? But I think, a very short definition is when we're talking about cognition, we're talking about thought processes.
And can you just touch on the difference between cognition and behavior?
Yeah, so that's one that it's hard for people to draw the line frequently, and one of the reasons, and we could get into this later, is that it has to do with how we study cognition, because cognition is internal in the mind, right? We can't sort of measure it directly, and even with techniques like brain imaging, we can see what the brain is doing, but it's really hard to translate that into like, okay, well, what is the content of thought going on here? It's one thing to say, oh, well, this area of the brain is very active, but that doesn't tell us much about like, well, so what are the kind of thoughts that correspond to that? So the way I think about it is that cognition is something that often precedes and motivates behavior, right? So like if an animal is looking for food, we might make some sort of inference about where they think the food is based on their behavior. Like, where do they go look for the food? But we're making an inference there about like, what's going on in the animal's mind. And so the cognition is the animal has some belief. They have some thought about where the food might be. And then often we sort of study that through their behavioral response. So probably a very succinct way to answer the question is that cognition is about thinking and behavior is about doing. And often the thinking we do shapes the behavior that we do. Yeah, so that would be my definition. I guess maybe a fun question to ask you about this then is, so if you're willing to go with my definition here, and if we talk about cognition essentially as internal mental processes, how on earth do we study this in animals that can't talk and can't tell us about the things that they're thinking?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the challenge, right? And I think, but going back to what you were saying about how cognition is what precedes behavior. Behavior is what we can see and what we can observe. And so then it's sort of up to us, and sort of what we're always trying to do with our research, to look at the behavior and then kind of extrapolate what does that mean about the cognition. And it's an imperfect process, obviously. And I think some ways that we deal with it is that we try to go about it through multiple lenses and then see if it kind of all matches up. So and, in practice, this is extremely similar to how we have to study the psychology of preverbal infants, right? It's just working with a species that can't talk back to you. So we have to use our powers of observation and then do, controlled studies to make sure that our inferences are holding up. So in our dog research, I think this can take many different forms. So one kind of simple measure that we often use is questionnaires, right? So in those cases, we're asking the person who lives with the dog and knows the dog best to describe their observation of the dog's behavior. And so, for example, if we're interested in knowing about like a trait, so something like trainability, we might ask the owner to rate behaviors such as, how willing is your dog to play fetch? How good or bad is your dog at ignoring distractions when you're trying to do a task? How much does your dog pay attention to you? And then we can also use behavioral tasks. So the advantage of these is that we can put all participants in a very similar situation. So kind of even the playing field, and then have the same set of like highly trained people administer these tasks, really try to standardize all components of the environment, and then video record their behavior. And so then instead of asking the owner to rate how much interest their dog has in humans, you can instead stand in front of them, recite a script using a high-pitched voice, and record how much time do they look to your face. And so that's just another window. Each has its pros and cons. Obviously, a pro of this is that there's this standardized environment and you're actually observing the behavior rather than relying on someone else's description of a behavior, right? Then you're kind of like 2 steps removed. But at the same time, it's very specific to that moment in time. And so it could be that, maybe the dog was really hungry, or maybe the dog was having an off day. And so, that's why we want to kind of pull from all different kinds of methodologies and start to build a bigger picture. And so what we often do in our lab are these behavioral tasks. And we have multiple that we do, probably 20 different ones, and they range in time from 2 to 10 minutes. And, it basically to the dog just looks like a fun game that we're playing with them. But to us, we're trying to get at different aspects of cognition, right? So how good is this dog's memory? Do they have impulse control? Are they paying attention to my social cues that I'm giving them? And so I wanted to share some videos with you all because I think, a picture video is worth 1,000 words, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. And you're going to see, we can do this at all ages. So you'll see both adult dogs and puppies, 8-week-old puppies in these videos. And you'll just see them doing some of our tasks. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So this first task we call the cylinder task. And what we're trying to get at here is the dog's impulse control. So when they see something that they really want, do they kind of run straight at it, even if that's not a productive solution? Or can they have the impulse control kind of take a step back and detour, even though they have to put distance between themselves and the desired object? It's ultimately going to lead to a better outcome. So what you'll see is kind of the different stages of the task. So we'll often have, something that we call a familiarization, and that's just sort of teaching the dog the rules of the task. And then in the test trials, we change something about it, and that's where we start to see variation in how dogs perform. So in this particular instance, the familiarization is going to be teaching the dog that, if I go around to the side of the cylinder, I'll get the treat. And you'll notice the cylinder will be opaque, so they cannot see the treat, so they have to go to a side. And then once they're reliably doing that, we switch it up on them. Same exact task, but it's now a transparent cylinder, so they can see the treat. There's now this temptation that wasn't there before. How does their impulse control hold up? So we just had some bloopers at the end there to show also the dogs really enjoy participating in these tasks. And then I just wanted to show one other set of videos, and these are specifically going to be some of our social cognition tasks. So things like following a pointing cue or the human interest task that I referenced earlier. And these are going to be the 8-week-old puppies performing them. So again, just to give you a sense of what the testing environment looks like.
Happy look. Happy look. Okay.
All right. So hopefully you enjoyed watching those as much as we enjoy doing these tasks with the puppies. But so I actually have another question for you, Evan. So if we can measure cognition in animals, are we basically studying how smart they are?
Yes and no would be my answer, I think. I guess before I answer that, I just want to say I'm so glad you showed some of those videos, because I think it illustrates some of the important points about why we do the experiments that we do, because any given behavior can be driven by different sort of cognitive processes, right? And so sometimes the real challenge is trying to figure out, okay, well, this is what the dog did, this is how the dog behaved, but why did they do that, and what did they know about the situation? And so, one of the things that we always try to do when we run experiments is to basically do an iterative process where we systematically sort of rule out other alternatives for how a dog is solving a problem. And so, for example, you showed those nice videos of a person giving a puppy some social information about where the food is, right, by using something like a pointing gesture. And, people would ask logical questions like, well, dogs have a really good sense of smell. So, how do we know that they're not just using their noses to get there? And so, not shown in those videos are the fact that we do systematic trials where everything is the same. The food is in one place. The puppy doesn't know where, but the person doesn't provide any information. So we can look at, is this a problem the dog can solve if the person doesn't communicate with them in some way, things like that. And so to me, that's really sort of at the heart of the experiments that we try to do, is that, people see in these videos sort of one condition where we're eliciting some sort of response from the dog, but often what we're doing is we have related conditions where we're trying to rule out or zero in on what might be going on in the dog's mind to help them solve these processes. So to your question about, are we studying how smart animals are? I gave that a qualified yes, I guess, because the very first thing that we do when we think about animal minds is we get rid of this idea that there's some sort of like ladder of intelligence, and we have some species that are just higher or lower on this ladder. Because the way that we think about the mind is that the mind is a product of evolution, right? And what evolution does is it selects for specific adaptations that help animals survive and reproduce in whatever environment they live in. And when it comes to the mind, some animals need to be able to solve certain kinds of problems, but not necessarily other kinds of problems. And so what we see is that actually animals, and people for that matter, can be smart in different kinds of ways, right? And so one of my favorite examples of this is if you look at, there are these birds, Clark's nutcrackers, that live in the mountains in the northwestern parts of North America. And they make a living eating pine seeds. And so during certain times of year, the pine seeds are really abundant. And so what they do is they get the seeds and they hide them, they cache them all over the environment. So they have access to lots of food, they take the food, they hide it all over the place. And then the winter comes around and there's not a lot of pine seeds to eat anymore. And so what the birds have to do is they have to remember, where are all the places that I hid these pine seeds some period of time ago? And these birds are like just amazing at doing this, and they can hide thousands and thousands of seeds. And then 3 to 6 months later, they can come back and they remember all the places that they hid all these seeds. And I couldn't do that. I don't know about you, but I can barely like find my car keys in the morning, much less finding, 2,000 things that I hid 6 months ago, over an area of miles. And when you do experiments with those birds, they have absolutely amazing memories for where things are in space, but they don't necessarily have good memories for other types of information. So you see a cognitive specialization where you have a problem that is really relevant to what this species has to do to survive and reproduce, and they're amazing at it, but they're not necessarily good at solving other kinds of problems. So one of the big challenges when we study animal cognition is trying to figure out, well, what are the different kinds of intelligence, and which types of intelligence the different species have more or less flexibility with. So it's really hard to, we can never make a blanket statement that, such and such is just a really intelligent species, and this is a dim-witted species or something like that, because it never comes out that way. Species are smart in different kinds of ways, and the same applies to humans, right? There are some things that we are very, very good at as humans, but there are other things that there are non-human animals that are much better at solving these problems than we are. So we try to define what are the different, we call them domains of intelligence, and then try to understand how species or individuals succeed or are limited in their cognition in different domains. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so changing gears a bit, something that I wanted to ask about. So obviously we're talking about cognition, but also this is the dog aging project, right? And so we're really interested, as a group in studying aging. And I think often when we think of aging, we think of physical traits and how that changes with time. But what about cognition? So what is the role of cognition in aging?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, one of the things that we're interested in the dog aging project is not just, figuring out what determines how long an animal lives, right? But trying to understand what promotes what we call health span, right? The period of life when you're in basically in good health, broadly speaking. Because, if you told me that I could live to be 150 years of age, but the last 50 years of my life, I was going to be bedridden and my memory was going to be falling apart and I was going to have all these problems. I don't know that I would be that interested in those extra 50 years. So we're really interested in health span. And I think having healthy cognition is a really important determinant of health span. And we know this because, for example, when people develop certain forms of dementia, this can really compromise their quality of life. And so me personally, what I'm hoping for when I age is that when I'm old, I hope that my mind is intact. I hope I continue to recognize the people around me, that I have memories of the past and things that happen to me on a day-to-day basis. And so thinking about cognitive health is really an important part of thinking about health span. And we certainly hope that will be the case for dogs as well. And we know it's not always the case, right? So dogs' cognition can become impaired quite a bit with age sometimes. And so it would be wonderful if we can understand what can we do, what are the factors that promote cognitive health across the lifespan. So I guess related to that, a question for you would be basically what we know about cognitive aging in dogs at this point. So I sort of alluded to the fact that we know that some dogs at least can develop age-related impairments, but do we know much about the way that cognitive processes in dogs change across their lifespan?
Yeah, that's a great question. So honestly, a lot of the cognitive research that has been conducted in the past 20 years has focused on adult dogs, but really just asking the question of if a dog even possesses a certain skill or not, right? Like, can dogs follow points kind of writ large? Of studies that have looked at changes with age, which is what we're asking about, they're often focused on the earlier end of the lifespan, right? So comparing puppies to adults. And you can do this either with a cross-sectional design, so you can have multiple groups of dogs at different ages, or a longitudinal design, right, where you follow the same dogs over time. And so I know recently, for example, our group has started looking at changes in cognition with age using this longitudinal design. And basically we measured cognitive traits in over 150 8-week-old puppies. And then in the sort of games that I showed videos of, and then we retested them on these same tasks when they were about 18 months of age. And one sort of interesting finding that has emerged from that work is that in their early years, similar to our early years as humans, right? Some skills take longer to develop than others. So we are seeing changes, and typically we're seeing growth, right? So, but some things are already online, right? So for example, by 8 weeks of age, puppies perform similarly on sensory discrimination tasks as they do as adults. However, a good example of a skill that is still developing, and this is true in humans as well, is impulse control. So as we saw, puppies can struggle with that cylinder task, and we see this pretty universally, that that's just really difficult for them. But it's actually one of the skills that population-wide improves the most with age. So when we go back and we test those, or I guess go forward and test those same dogs when they hit 18 months, we see vast improvement and kind of the most improvement of any task that we give them. And part of that is because they start out pretty poorly, but so that develops with age. In terms of how cognition changes from adult dogs to more senior dogs, there's honestly not a ton of research, but there's a little bit, and evidence does suggest that, we do see changes in things like memory, social engagement. One thing there was a study recently, I think you're an author on it actually, that's super cool, is that we know, for example, that large dogs physiologically age at a faster rate than smaller dogs. However, in terms of cognitive health, when you look at that, it appears that dogs, regardless of size, are actually following a similar trajectory. So interestingly, all dog breeds, regardless of their average size or lifespan, seem to follow this similar pattern of cognitive aging. And so this basically means that what we see is larger dogs who tend to not live as long are experiencing limited cognitive decline at the end of their shorter lives, right? So in other words, one interpretation is that they're passing away before they reach these severe levels of cognitive decline that we sometimes see in the smaller dogs.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the Dog Aging Project is going to be really important in helping us figure out how robust that phenomenon is. So you're right, and I was lucky to be an author on that paper. It's one data set, and that does seem to be what we see in that data set so far. But it's going to be just so exciting, thanks to the contributions of everybody, all the participants in this project, generating information about their dogs to see, is that really something that is a robust phenomenon. So you mentioned that one of the things that seems to change with age in dogs is memory. And we know that that's certainly true in humans as well, right? As we age, our memory tends to be not quite as sharp as it always was. And I think that is, by and large, like partly a normal process of aging. But we know in humans that there are situations where things like memory impairments become pathological, right? And we have forms of dementia like Alzheimer's disease, where it's not just sort of, a little age-related loss in memory, it's really profound impairments here. What do we know about whether dogs develop pathologies like something like Alzheimer's disease? Do dogs get dementia?
Yeah, so in dogs, we know that they get something that veterinarians would diagnose as canine cognitive dysfunction. And like you mentioned, it's a pathology, right? So that's abnormally more dysfunction than you would see just in the normal course of aging. And it shares a lot of similarities with Alzheimer's disease. And basically it's diagnosed by a veterinarian based on a physical exam that they do of the dog, and also owner observations of certain behaviors. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where we have questionnaires where owners are the people that see their dog every day. And so they can speak to things like whether certain behaviors are present, and also whether they've gotten worse, in like a 6-month time frame. So are we seeing drastic changes? And behaviorally, things that veterinarians are asking about to sort of help in this diagnosis are things like pacing, avoiding social behaviors like being petted, changes in spatial awareness, sleeping patterns might change or be disrupted, difficulty finding food that's dropped on the ground. And, some of this is individualized, right? Like if you were never a dog that liked petting, it's probably not that concerning that as you age, you still don't like petting. But especially that change, right? Maybe all of a sudden you do like petting, or so they kind of have to take a general look at all these behavior, just one given behavior changing on its own might not be enough or a cause for concern, but if you're starting to see them add up, then that could lead to a diagnosis of canine cognitive dysfunction. So as you mentioned, I think the Dog Aging Project is just this amazing opportunity to begin looking at cognition, and especially as it relates to aging. So how is the Dog Aging Project incorporating studies of cognition already within the project?
Yeah, well, it's a growing area of research within the Dog Aging Project. So I think one of the first things that we have been using is an instrument called the Canine Social and Learned Behaviors Survey, and that is, as you mentioned earlier, basically a questionnaire measure that tells us things about behavioral changes that people might see in dogs that might indicate something about changes in their cognition. So it, captures things about are there times, for example, when a dog seems disoriented in a familiar environment, they have a hard time sort of finding their way around, or they're no longer seem to recognize people that they used to know very well. And so that's a really powerful way to look at potential symptoms of dementia and age-related changes, but it measures the kinds of things that are pretty big changes in behavior, pretty profound changes in behavior that may be linked to cognitive decline. So one thing we know from the study of cognitive aging in humans is that before you get to anything like full-blown dementia, there are often much subtler kinds of cognitive impairments that you might not notice. You could talk to somebody, you'd have no idea that they were starting to become cognitively impaired. But if you do some sorts of neuropsychological tests, sure enough, you can see that there are certain components of their cognition that are no longer functioning the way that they used to. So one of the newer things that we're doing we are rolling out these community science cognitive assays. And these are tests that are based on exactly the kind of work that you showed earlier, these experiments we do with dogs, but they're tests that people can do at home with their dogs. And so basically we give people a simple set of instructions for how to set up an activity, and we walk them through what we want them to do with their dog, and they tell us about what their dog does in that situation, and we're collecting that data. So these are in contrast to being surveys, these are actual experiments that Dog Aging Project participants are doing in their home, and they're incredibly valuable because they're going to allow us to, if you and I just wanted to do these experiments as we try to do, maybe like we have a really good year and we could test 100 dogs on these things. But the possibility for huge numbers of people to help us do these experiments at home and contribute that information to the project is going to be just a huge game changer in terms of the way that we understand cognition, age-related changes in cognition in dogs. And at some point, I can talk a little bit more about one of the activities that we're doing there. Maybe I could just ask you a broad question before we get there, which is, so given that the Dog Aging Project is incorporating these studies of cognition, what are the kinds of things that we're hoping to learn about in terms of cognitive aging in dogs?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think as we've been alluding to, this is such an exciting opportunity, and in large part thanks to you all, which, you guys can be community scientists yourselves by helping out with this. And so by following thousands of dogs longitudinally, we can start to get clarity on these questions that, like I said, there's not much to go off of in the literature, right? So in terms of cognition, what are the typical patterns of change with age as we get into that senior dog realm? And then I think hopefully it can lead to solutions, right? So, and in really understanding the factors of what contributes to healthy cognitive aging, and back to that idea of health span, not just lifespan. So one aspect that I think is really great about the Dog Aging Project is that all of the PAC members every year fill out their health and life experience survey. And so that is going to be able to let us look for broad associations between performance on these tasks, so whether your dog participates in the 1, 2, 3 treat task that Evan will describe momentarily, right? Then we can look at other demographic variables. So obviously age is an obvious one, but also things like how physically active is the dog? What's their training background? What's their diet, including everything from their eating habits to if you have them on dietary supplements. And can we see any associations between any of these factors and what's going on in terms of their cognitive aging? And so then in a practical sense, I think one of the hopes is that we can even identify, as Evan alluded to, early indicators that a dog might develop dementia. And then obviously sort of down the road, the ultimate step is some sort of intervention measure. But I think in order to get there, we need to kind of gather all the baseline data, and that's where the Dog Aging Project is going to be invaluable. And so, Evan was talking about this cognitive task that PAC members can do. And so can you kind of specifically share some of the details of that, Evan, what that would look like to participate in?
Yeah, I sure can. I have a couple slides here that I could share just to give a brief overview of the task. So let me get these up for you. Okay, so the very first task that we're having people participate in, this is going out to people slowly. So if you haven't received this yet, you may in the near future. But this is a game we call the 1, 2, 3 treat activity. And basically what this activity is it's a food finding task for the dog. So from the dog's perspective, they're just looking for food. They're having a good time trying to get something to eat. But it's also a memory game that allows us to look at some aspects of what dogs remember about things that have happened recently. So what we have people do is it's kind of a DIY project at home. We have people construct 3 small cardboard boxes that they set up in an array that looks something like this in front of their dog. People do a few warm-up trials to familiarize their dog with kind of the basics of the game and get the dogs used to things like looking for food in these boxes. And then once they're done with that, they play this game that has sort of 9 rounds. So there's 9 rounds of the game. And basically what happens is that on every round of the game, all 3 of these boxes here are going to get a treat placed in them. And the person walks the dog in a circle around the boxes. And as they do that, the dog is allowed to eat the treat from 2 of the 3 boxes. So by the time the person has finished walking the circle around the boxes, the dog will have eaten 2 of the treats, but one of those boxes still has a treat left in it. So when they complete the circle and the dog is coming back and standing in front of all 3 boxes again here, the dog is released to sort of go look for that one remaining treat. And the question is, does the dog remember which box still has a treat left in it? So just to kind of give you a visual depiction of what this looks like. So on any given round of the game, the dog starts in a position here. We call this the start line. And the person and the dog will walk to one of these boxes here. And then the person is going to drop a treat into the box. So the dog sees the treat go into the box. And then they're either allowed to eat the treat or not allowed to eat the treat, depending on what we tell the person to do on this particular trial. So let's say on this one, the dog is allowed to eat the treat that was just placed into box 1. So you can hear your dog scrunching up the food there. So the treat goes in, the dog eats the treat. Now you move along to box 2. Piece of food goes in box 2. And we'll say on this trial, this is the one piece of food that the dog is not allowed to eat. So they have to leave box 2, but the food is still in there. Now they come around to box 3. Treat goes in box 3. And then immediately the dog is allowed to eat that treat. And then lastly, the dog comes back and now they get a chance to go look for that one remaining treat. And the question is, does the dog remember which of the 3 boxes still contains a treat? So the person lets the dog go and the dog is allowed to go search in the boxes. And if the dog finds the one remaining treat, they are allowed to eat it. So it's a game that we have people do 9 rounds of this game. And on every round, the location that the dog is not allowed to get the treat from berries. So we tell people this on every round, on this round, your dog is not allowed to eat the treat from box 1 or box 3, so on and so forth. And we do 9 rounds of this, and we look at basically where the dog is searching for the treat. It's a fun game, and it's a flexible game, and people can play this either inside their house if they have an open area, or they can also do it outside. The key is really just to find an area that doesn't have too many distractions for your dog while you're doing the activity. A couple of common questions that we get about this task, I thought I would just touch on. So one is, people might ask, well, what if when I release my dog to go look for that last treat, what if my dog is frequently going to empty boxes, so they don't seem to be solving the problem? And the answer is that is 100% okay, and that's really valuable for us to know. We have used this task with lots of dogs, and it's very rare that dogs would find the food all the time. In fact, in my experience, I've never seen a dog that finds the food all the time. So we don't expect them to always know where the food is. And you shouldn't worry. The most important thing is just to be honest in telling us about what your dog did. The other thing is that different dogs will react differently to this game. And so some people might have the sort of impression that as they're doing this, there's something about the game that the dog just doesn't seem to get. And they might wonder, should we complete this activity? Should we do this, given that my dog doesn't quite seem to understand what's going on? And again, the answer is an emphatic yes, as long as you and your dog are having a good time. So as long as you're comfortable participating, definitely still complete the activity. We know that different dogs react very differently to this game. And actually, by collecting data from lots of different dogs, this is going to be helpful for us in terms of understanding what the various strategies are that dogs might use in a task like this. And then the other common question I think we get is, so now I've done the activity, what do the results of the game tell me about my dog? Can you tell me something about my dog's memory? And the answer is probably not based on a single administration of this game. This is just a short activity, and it's hard for us to say anything really confidently about a dog based on how they performed in the game one time. What's most interesting to us from a scientific perspective is that dogs are going to complete this game once a year going forward, and we're interested in if and how the way that a dog approaches the game changes across time, because we know there are different kinds of strategies dogs can use, and we're interested in whether those strategies change across time. So that is just a brief introduction to the 1, 2, 3 treat activity. And I'm so grateful that people are going to help us collect this data. I think it'll be a really fun thing to do with your dog, and we look forward to people participating. So maybe we can, I know we got some questions in advance from the dog park, which is always such a fun place to see what people are talking about and thinking about. We can, I think we won't get a chance to answer all of these, but we can answer a select few, and then we can respond to others directly in the dog park. So one question we have here is, do dogs understand when people point at something with their hands or their finger? And the person who's asking this question says, it looks to me like my dog looked at the hand finger itself and not necessarily what they're pointing at. So is this an observation? Is this a common observation that animals will look at sort of the gesture rather than what the person is pointing to? And is it a uniquely human thing that we seem to understand pointing cues? So Emily, I know you know a lot about this. Do you want to try to answer that?
Sure. Yeah, we've been thinking about pointing a lot lately. So we know that by and large, adult dogs get pointing, but I think sort of as I believe this was by Florida Dog Mom is alluding to, there's some differences, right? So whether the dog is realizing that you're pointing to a place that they need to, communicating information to them about a place versus just, they come up and sniff your finger. And so what we have done recently is tested this ability in young puppies. So if you point to a location and an 8-week-old puppy is standing in front of you, do they perform as we would expect an adult dog to perform and kind of go to the location that you're indicating and recognize that this is a communicative cue that you're giving them? And basically, we tested 375 puppies on this, and we found that this is an early emerging skill from a very young age. And prior to extensive experience with humans, these were actually young, hopeful service dog puppies. So they were not yet living with their puppy raiser at this point. They were still living with their litter mates in a human home, of course, but that, their main source of interaction was their litter mates. If you do this pointing task with them, they are above chance at using your point to go to location to find food. And furthermore, we actually found that this skill had a very strong genetic component. So we could measure something that we call the heritability. So that's the variation in that trait that is due to genetics. So as I said, the dogs as a whole can do this above chance, but we see variation. And so what is driving that variation? And we find that 43% of the variation is due to genetic factors, which is quite a large amount. And that actually means that can be selected upon, right? So because there is such a strong genetic basis. And so I think, kind of going back to your question about, is this unique to dogs? It seems like this is something that through domestication has really emerged in this species, that we have this special relationship. And in particular, they're really good at reading our social cues. So we have some other questions from the dog park. This one is from Elphaba, and she was wondering what makes different breeds behave differently. So the example that she gave was prey drive, right? So a sight hound will pursue and kill the prey, but a herding dog is going to stop themselves right before they get to that stage, and they're just going to exhibit the herding behavior. So Evan, are these dogs hardwired in their brain to behave differently? What's happening there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Everyone is always interested in breed differences, and I'm very interested in breed differences too. I think the most effective way to answer this question is to say that you can think of breed differences as tendencies, right? So on average, breed A may be more likely to engage in some kind of behavior than breed B. Right. But there's still, for almost any behavioral trait we look at, there's still going to be tremendous overlap between those breeds. So, so there are certainly some genetically driven breed differences in different aspects of behavior, but breed is not destiny when it comes to behavior, right? And so, an example I use is something like, you could look at differences in height between men and women, for example, right? And, they're on average, men are taller than women, right? But you can find lots of women that are taller than lots of men. So you have overlapping distributions. And there's some mean difference between those groups, where in one group, the trait is a little bit more, and in another group, the trait is a little bit less. But that doesn't mean that if you're a woman, you're going to be shorter than all men, or if you're a man, you're going to be taller than all women. So you can think of the genetics here as kind of being a nudge in a particular direction, but it's not a destiny. There's we know in the vast majority of cases breeds overlap in almost all of the behavioral traits we might look at. Another question from the dog park from Mary Ellen says, my pup Hunter seems to recognize about 70 words. Wow, that's pretty impressive. Just curious, what's the average for canines recognizing words? And a related question we could ask is another person from the pack asks, how does my dog's brain process our language? So what do we know about dogs' understanding of words and language?
Yeah, so this is actually a fascinating area of research. You guys might have heard of dogs like Chaser or Rico, and these were border collies, or our border collies that know all of these words. And so I don't know if we know as a field, right, what the average for canines recognizing words is. We do know that in certain cases, they can recognize hundreds of words and learn them. And kind of going to the question about brains processing language, I think one of the most fascinating findings sort of out of this area is how the dogs are learning these words, the ones that know so many. And so they've been able to show evidence for something that's called fast mapping. And this is really interesting because this is something that we as humans can also do, but it's pretty cognitively complex. So the idea is that learning by inference, basically. So if you have 3 objects and you know the name of 2 of them, and then your owner starts referring to this third word that you've never heard before, fast mapping would be for you to infer that, oh, that word I've never heard refers to the object that I don't know the name of. And so dogs have been shown to be able to do this, which is really impressive. I think something to note, though, is that not all dogs can do this. So there's actually active research going on right now in a lab based in Hungary, and they have been studying these gifted word learning dogs. And they found, I think that, they've been, they've probably heard of Chase or Enrico, and they sort of sent out a call and said, hey, get in touch, if you have a dog and you think they can do this. And so I think and they actually had like a fun YouTube challenge you could watch. The dog, they had 3 weeks to learn all these words. And I think there were 7 of them that could basically do it no problem. But then for those 7, there are hundreds of others that just are not able to have, that's not their special skill. So it's sort of interesting to think about, but yeah, I don't know that we know the average across dogs for word learning, but we know that they can do it, which is pretty interesting. All right. Here's a fun one. This is from Sarah Burney in the dog park. And Evan, she would like to know what her Cavalier's big eyes are telling her when the dog makes eye contact with her, then looks at the treat bag, then looks back to her, and then back to the treat bag. Do you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a tantalizing observation. And one thing we know about dogs is that they use eye contact with people in a very communicative way, in ways that lots of other species don't seem to. So there have been some studies basically asking this question about, is this possibly a form of showing behavior, right? And is this, if a dog knows something about, I want something, or I know where something is, and I need to communicate with somebody to tell them about it, can I do, or how do dogs do that? And so this is one of the indicators that people have used. They talk about this as gaze alternation, or possibly even trying to establish what we call joint attention, right? Where you're communicating with somebody else and you're trying to establish communication about some other thing. And we know that in young human babies, for example, one way babies do this is they get interested in some object, they might even point at it, and then they alternate their gaze between that object and the person. And so it may be a communicative strategy where the Cavalier here is trying to communicate something there. It may also be that the Cavalier, King Charles here, knows the relevant pieces, the thing I want and the person, and it's sort of a monitoring process where the dog is just looking back and forth between the two, not necessarily trying to communicate. It's really hard to get answers to those questions without the kinds of systematic experiments that we talked about earlier. But suffice it to say that there have been some experiments that suggest that dogs do some kinds of showing behavior like this. So I think we're probably just about out of time, but we can, I'm sure that we can answer. We got lots of great questions that unfortunately we didn't have time to get to, and I'm sure that we can hop in the dog park and answer some of these questions. We'll look forward to it. It was really fun to read some of the submissions, and I'm eager to respond to them. So I think I'd just wrap up by extending a real heartfelt thank you to everybody watching. We are so deeply grateful for everything you do to make this project a success, and we're so excited to work with you in this process of scientific discovery. So thanks so much.
All right, that concludes our April Pack event. A huge thank you to Evan and Emily for sharing their knowledge and experience with canine cognition. That was super insightful, and hopefully everyone learned something new today, because I know I did. And for all our pack members who are currently watching and participating at today's event, thank you so much. We are truly grateful and appreciate you for all your continued support. We couldn't do this without you. And if you haven't already, head over to the dog park and enter in our pack appreciation giveaway. We'll announce the winners there on the dog park. And if you have any remaining questions about today's event, put them at the dog park. We'll answer them there too. Now, Now, speaking of the dog park, a quick shout out to Eric, the dog father of the dog park and our tech guru behind the scenes. He put this wonderful event together and we're so grateful. Thank you so much, Eric. Also, be sure to come back next month with Dr. Amanda Tinkle. She's going to join us and talk about dog mobility. Have you ever wondered how dogs can run so fast, or how big dogs move differently from small dogs, or even a horse? Well, Dr. Tinkle will have a great presentation for you in May with tons of pictures and videos to make sense of it all. So stay tuned. Now, before we leave this month, we have a message from our team for a very special person who is moving on to a well-deserved retirement. DJ, we'll miss you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Creevy, the Chief Veterinary Officer for the Dog Aging Project. I'd like to welcome you to a special part of today's PAC Appreciation event, where we say congratulations and farewell to DJ. DJ Hartz is the Senior Administrative Coordinator for the Texas A&M offices of the Dog Aging Project, and she has held this role for the past several years and performed with excellence. She keeps us on schedule, she keeps us organized, she keeps us honest. She helps us move projects from idea to completion. She keeps track of the details. She doesn't sweat the small stuff. She creates, she contributes, she leads, she listens, and she has a terrific sense of humor. DJ, it has been a privilege and a pleasure to work with you. We're so happy for you. We're so grateful for you, and we're going to miss you like crazy. We wish you every success in the next chapter of your life. Thank you, DJ.
DJ, you are one of my favorite people, personally and professionally, and you are going to be greatly missed around the Dog Aging Project office, but I wish you nothing but the most wonderful retirement, and it has been wonderful to work with you and get to know you.
Thank you for everything, DJ.
DJ, I'm going to miss you so much. Thank you for bringing such a positive attitude and energy to this project. You're going to be missed by everyone.
Thank you, DJ, for everything you've done to make this project move more smoothly and make it easier for us as the research team to get things done.
DJ, what are we going to do without you? To say that you'll be missed is an understatement.
DJ, I hope you get to enjoy your retirement and go on all those trips that you've always dreamed of, and eat lots of lunches and read all the books.
DJ, it has been such a privilege getting to work with you these past 6 months. You've been nothing but kind and warm and helpful, and I appreciate everything you've done for me during my time here.
It's been quite the journey. I can't imagine it without you. Thank you for everything you've done.
Hi, DJ. I hope you have a lot of fun and get to enjoy your retirement. We'll definitely miss you here at the office.
Jesus, nice. We'll miss you so much. Thanks for everything over the last couple of years. I'll miss all your funny gifts in the Slack channel. We're going to miss you.
Bye, DJ. We'll miss you.
Goodbye. We'll miss you.
Congrats on your retirement. We'll miss you.
Goodbye. We'll miss you.
Goodbye. We'll miss you.
Bye, DJ. We'll miss you.
We'll miss you.